Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Işıl Anam. I am the Director of Curatorial Research at the MA Curatorial Practice Program. And I'm incredibly happy with incredible panelists today with me, where we are going to, I think, discuss something extremely important for all of us, and your participation is very important for that too. I would like to tell you that if I'm not mistaken, this is actually our first in-person meeting since the pandemic. So forgive us our clumsiness if technicality goes a little bit wrong. We've been doing our best for this. We also have our curatorial students here who helped immensely in setting up this environment. So thank you so much. And my colleague Ricky has been a great help too. Thank you, Ricky. So the questions that we will be discussing today, of course, on the one hand, the problems of curators and curatorial issues that we tackle about, but it is also how the museums can be relevant and useful in the future, as far as we can actually see our future problems. How can they be spaces where unlikely communities come together, new communities form, and where we bring the discussions, artistic expression, in a way that actually cannot happen anywhere else. So all these spaces that we have been creating since the beginning of human civilization, that is now again useful, meaningful for all of us. So many of these spaces are in transformation already. But it's always important, of course, to look back how that transformation is happening. So right now I have four distinguished speakers here, not only doing their curatorial job, but actually being active participants of these transformation processes, how these transformations should happen. And I actually did ask certain questions to panelists, and I was planning to read them right now, but actually they will come back later at the end of your presentation, Christina, so we will be able to also see them. But the presenters here will be responding to those questions from their approaches, based on their practices and their thinking for the future. So thank you very much for being here. I don't want to repeat the biographies that we already presented. So I would like to immediately start with Christina. Every speaker here will have 12 to 15 minutes, and then once the presentation is ended, we will be discussing basically, and we will be very happy if you also participate in that discussion. Thank you so much.
Hi everybody, I'm Chrissy. Oh, thank you, Shin.
Actually, maybe it wouldn't be too bad if just briefly tell who everyone is. Maybe you didn't have a chance to read, so you don't have to present yourself. Christina Young is an independent curator who has held curatorial roles at the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archive, Williams College Museum of Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Queen's Museum, and she's also from our faculty. Chrissy Isles is the Anne and Joel Ahrens, how do I pronounce that? Ehrenkranz curator at the Whitney Museum of American Art, specializing in contemporary art, film, and video. She also co-curated the Whitney Biennial recently, and also she's from our faculty. And Kate Fowle, former director of MoMA PS1 and chief curator of the Garage Museum of Contemporary Art in Moscow, is currently curatorial senior director at Hauser and Wirth in New York, and she's also from our faculty. And our guest speaker today is Tom Finkelper, previously commissioner of the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and executive director of the Queen's Museum, is currently a consultant for the Andrew Mellon Foundation. So the reason I actually decided to read again, you have heard multiple names of museums and institutions, and although the title primarily is about museum, I particularly would like to talk about in general about institutions and what these institutions can do otherwise. Thank you so much.
So I do have some projects and some images and some ideas I want to share with you. But I'm actually really excited to get a conversation going with all of us. So I'm going to move kind of as quickly as possible through the images and try to just get some practical and some provocative kind of questions and notions out there. Okay, so I think of myself as a contemporary art curator who has been fortunate to follow the lead of artists for the last 2 decades. And that's includes getting a grounding in emerging and experimental genres, which includes new media, performance, pedagogy, and social practice. So recently, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, especially coming out of the pandemic, like many of you, and then like as Ishin kind of provoked, I've been tracking the sort of impact of, what we call by the acronym DEIA and its impact on curatorial practice in museums. And I'm actually, and that's why I started with this quote that, in thinking about how curators can be agents for change and agents for a kind of, activist position within their institution, I've actually come back to the role as being instrumental and as being urgent today. I think maybe I will get some contestation and pushback on that as to what the limitations are, but I don't know. It's brought me a tremendous amount of joy and purpose to be really in that in thinking about those aspirations. And I will say that like so many new things maybe you need to take on as a thinker, as a curator, as a person. Once you actually engage with it and once you do the research and actually start practicing, it becomes part of who you are. And to the point where actually I do feel that practices of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility can become part of your everyday thinking. And I would love to hear from you, especially the generation of emerging curators, how you're finding that or not. Maybe so we can go to the next slide. Okay, so in keeping with the mission of this program, I'm going to go through a couple of projects I've worked on, but I really want to present them with a few takeaways and sort of lessons I've learned along the way. So thinking about the work of curators as a practice, and especially as a practice of care. The title is Practices of Care, or How to Build a Curatorial Practice with a Parent, the Police, in a Prison, and with Prostitutes. So that's a big aspiration, but that's actually some of the optics I've had to work with as a curator and that I've learned quite a bit from. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so as Ishin and I were talking about what I might present, she was intrigued with this idea that I had worked in an initiative and a genre that we define as social practice. So I just thought I would put up a definition that was useful for us at the time, which I would say would be around 2015, 2014, even though it's actually a genre that's been in academic circles for a while. So what is social practice art? An artistic practice that freely blurs the lines among object making, performance, community organizing, political activism, environmentalism, and social justice issues to create a deeply participatory art that can flourish within or beyond the walls of the museum. Why don't we go to the next slide? So with that working definition, when I was working at the Guggenheim, we were fortunate to get 2 grants that allowed us to commission artists and to experiment in this area. So we created a sort of sub-definition within social practice that we ended up calling Guggenheim social practice. We went through lots of different conversations about what to name our program, and because there were so many great names Creative Time or Blade of Grass, but actually someone came to us and said, well, how will we say Guggenheim social practice? And he would say, well, that's just a contradiction. The Guggenheim doesn't do social practice. And so, but then we came back and said, no, that's what we want to do. We actually want to change a little bit about what the perception is of the Guggenheim. And whatever happens in social practice is, it's already kind of codified or changed a little bit. So Guggenheim Social Practice then was begun in 2014. GSP is a museum-based initiative that commissions social practice artists to develop significant projects with the public or specific communities and together with the Guggenheim, foster new forms of public engagement. So, I mean, through a series of advisory board meetings and our own research and inviting artists to submit proposals, we did end up commissioning 3 different projects from 4 different artists. I'll give you one other anecdote. On one of our advisory committees, the recognized artist who started Project Row Houses, Rick Lowe, said to us, well, $1 million is not enough to make social change. And our budget at the time was $500,000. And so we were like, well, what are we going to do about that? Here's the preeminent social practice artist telling us that, we don't have enough money. But we did end up hiring a full-time project manager for 3 years. And what we decided was that we figured with $100,000, again, 3 per project, we might still be able to find an artist who wanted to work with us and wanted to experiment with doing some sort of project with the Guggenheim and with the public. So we really treated it as an experiment, and we got better at defining what we were trying to do. We realized we weren't necessarily trying to, make social change or even be a social justice organization. We actually went back to our mission, which was part of our mission, which was working with artists to think about working with the public. So, we kind of curtailed it down to what, the public recognized the Guggenheim for. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I'm going to talk about one project and one part of that project. This was a project that came to us from Leica Clayton and John Rubin, who are 2 artists based in Pittsburgh. The title of the project was A Talking Parrot, a high school drama class, a Punjabi TV station, the oldest song in the world, a museum artwork, and a congregation's call to action circle through New York. What these artists did was they came to New York and we asked them to develop a proposal around the Guggenheim itself. And they said, well, we don't really know the Guggenheim, but we're just going to take an arbitrary circle, draw it around the Guggenheim, and see what we find. So they were really interested that we weren't so far from Rikers Island or LaGuardia Airport, and they wanted to see what would happen if they drew a circle through all 5 boroughs. So through a process of research, they came up with 6 collaborators. I'm going to pass these around if you want to pass it around. You can go to the next slide. And they asked 6 different community partners to contribute a piece of their identity, and each of the partners would then simultaneously host and also become part of a new world. So, for example, and I'm going to talk specifically about the talking parrot because the parrot was the most demanding of the objects that we were circulating. And it's also the one I learned the most from, I would say, as a curator. But the talking parrot was a piece of the identity of a pet shop in the Bronx. And the parrot went to Frank Sinatra High School in Queens, Juice Broadcasting in Queens, St. Philip's Church in Harlem, to the Guggenheim, Manhattan, and then also to the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World, which was a research institute also in Manhattan. So the title of the artwork was every object that was circulating. What I'm sending around is a little wheel that shows what happened every month when the object shifted and where it went. So it was just, again, a graphic that the artists really loved and to them kind of represented the project. Go to the next slide. So again, and this was a complicated 24/7, 6-month-long project. Next slide. But I just thought I would just go a little deeper into the journey with the singular object, and again talk about how I was changed, and then in what ways the project made an impact. So this is Pinky the parrot, the so-called talking parrot, who actually did not talk. Well, actually, she only spoke if she was very, very comfortable with where she was living and with the person that she was with. So here she is here at home in the pet shop with her beloved caretaker, Aubrey Michael. And the only time I ever heard her speak was when she was at home, actually with Aubrey in the pet shop. And but what was so interesting about this project was actually working with the artists and going with them on the leap of their imagination. They loved the idea that there was a talking parrot that could circulate into a high school, into a church, into a museum. So they said, no, we're keeping the title. It's like, it doesn't matter if the parrot actually talks or not, or what the conditions are. This is what our artwork is about. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go through these quickly. So this is Pinky at Frank Central High School teaching a dance lesson to the students. Next slide, please. This is Pinky at the broadcast station as a sort of television commentator. Next slide. And so this is Pinky now coming to the Guggenheim. So at each new site, the artists dictated that they wanted Pinky to be fully integrated into the operations of that organization. So, which is why she was both an actor and a director at the broadcast station. She became, a faculty member at the high school, and she also became, part of life drawing lessons and, on and on into every venue. So when she came to the Guggenheim, the artists had, many proposals for us. They really wanted Pinky to not only be an object of art, but they really wanted Pinky to be an educator and a curator. And at times, they wanted her to actually, they were hoping she would actually be able to talk and execute security, but that didn't happen. But that's okay. There was a leap of the imagination they asked for us. So then the care of Pinky, though, if you can imagine, was very, very deep. So I'm showing her here with her own dedicated art handler who had to be trained in handling tropical birds. And tropical birds are, if any of you know, highly emotional and actually dangerous animals. I mean, they have a very sharp beak, and she was a big bird. I mean, maybe a foot tall, and she has claws, talons that can be used for self-defense. But luckily, at the same time, there was oh my God, why am I spacing him? Who's the other Brazilian artist? Not Elijah Clark, the man. Otesica. So there was a Helio Otesica show up at the Whitney, I think.
Yes.
That summer, 2017, and thankfully we were able to share art handlers who could actually take care of birds. So this is Pinky with her dedicated art handler. Next slide. So Pinky had 2 cages that she lived in. One was her presentation cage, one was her home cage, because she did not sleep up in the rotunda when she was with us for a month. So she had another private cage that she slept in. Next slide. She also had tons of toys, all her food, all her drink. This is Pinky with the non-objective film program that she curated from the Guggenheim's collection. Next slide. And here, I mean, I will say though, as demanding as Pinky was as a co-creator of this art project, she was an incredibly beautiful person. I mean, I really came to know her for her personality. I mean, I still think about Pinky as I think of her as a person, and I had to think of her as not just someone I was taking care of, for 6 months, but I had to think of her on every level of what I was working, how I was working. And so for me, that was something that never happened to me as a curator. How did that change the museum and the public? I can say that actually we did 2 evaluation reports that are, extensive and well researched, and they seem to feel like the public was intrigued by Pinky. Okay, next slide. Okay, so here's something else to share with all of you as curators. As much like attention, labor, budget, documentation that we lavished on this project, at some point we were maxed out as a staff of 3 people. And when we tried to, if you can imagine what it's like to just bring a public to a museum, to school, to a church, all that activity was something that we were trying to facilitate with these new alien beings. But what the artists expected was actually that they would receive new publics and that they would have critical attention as artists. And in fact, that was difficult for us to actually to generate. So when I think about this project, I have my regrets, include that we maybe weren't clear enough with the artists about, what our capacity was, but also I just wasn't as skilled enough in terms of managing their expectations. And so that was a learning for me, and just something that like I'm sure we've all had to go through before. So what happened was though, when we came around to time to do our second project, we decided that we would adjust our parameters, and instead of working with artists who were not based in New York, we actually looked for a local artist. We actually looked for an artist who was more emerging in their career, and we actually then decided that we would try, but we were more explicit about the project taking place on site at the Guggenheim, so we would be more confident of generating a public that that would recognize them as an artist. So our third artist is Sean Leonardo, who you get a little picture of him here. You might know him as the co-founder of Recess, which is an arts diversion program that works with the New York City justice court system. He's also just recently recently left. He was a co-founder of Recess. He recently left them as their co-director and is now the co-director of Socrates Sculpture Park. Okay, next slide. So as I mentioned, we moved this project to the Guggenheim, and this project was fascinating because it was called Primitive Games. It had two components. One was very public, which was this performance that took place at the museum, and you can see that it's staged as a almost as like a Renaissance parade or something. The basis of the proposal was Sean wanted to see what would happen if 4 different groups came together who had never met each other, who didn't know each other, but were all coming from different perspectives of owning a gun, and how might it be possible for them to engage in a silent debate. So the debate modeled this Italian sports game that he was interested in called Calcio Storico. So we can go to the next slide, and you can just sort of see some images of Sean himself, kind of like proceeding through the performance. Next slide. With the participants who are, so this is now all 4 of the groups brought together, and I'll talk about the groups in a second. Next slide. And you can see we got like fantastic audience. It looked amazing. Obviously we took tremendous like video and photography. There was, a Brazilian all-women drum corps. We had the banners. Everyone was in costume. It was, a big night at the Guggenheim. Next slide. And this is sort of the ending of the performance, where it just was this duet with Sean and one of his collaborators. Next slide. So sorry these images are a little blurry. I pulled them off of my computer earlier today. So the more interesting component of this performance was actually the workshops that Sean did with the 4 individual groups. So the 4 individual groups were New York City policemen, veterans, youth impacted by gun violence, and members of a recreational gun club. So before the public performance, Sean worked with all 4 of these groups and did these kind of theatrical exercises built around Augusto Boal, this Brazilian director and activist on a pedagogy that he called the theater of the oppressed, and also different kinds of like trauma therapy that he has learned himself as a facilitator. We can go to the next slide. And then this is the veterans. Next slide. This is the veterans again, I think. In the next slide. So this is an image of him with the police group, and so I'm going to share with you one interesting takeaway that I didn't expect from working with the police. When it came time for the final performance, one of the policemen actually was on call that day. And so one of my co-curators came to me and said, actually it was a project manager, Anna Harshani. She said, I can't remember his name was, Robert actually can come, but he has to come and he has to bring his gun with him. And I just wanted to check to make sure that was okay within museum rules. And I said, oh, I think we have a gun law at the museum, and I think that they're not allowed on site. You know, it's like we just are a gun-free zone. And so I said, well, let me go talk to security and let me let them know that, you know, he needs to bring his gun or else we can't have him in the performance. So when I went to them expecting them to like hold the line, and I expected to hold the line too, and that we were going to have to proceed without this one participant. But surprisingly, our security team said to me, no, if there's an off-duty policeman on site and something happens, we want them to be able to be, you know, to do their job. And so I was like completely shocked, and I was like, are you sure? And like, do we really want to be thinking about that? And you know, should we not, you know, try to divert a situation another way? They're like, no, that's what we want and that's what we recommend. And so I was like, well, again, you know, doing these kinds of projects is a lot about talking to your colleagues and also about listening to your colleagues. And at some point, I spoke to, you know, Anna, my co-curator, Nat Trotman, who also teaches here. I said, well, what should we do? And they're like, you know, I don't think we're going to make this into a political decision. We should just listen to our colleagues and let them be comfortable with it. And I was like, okay. So that's what we did. And I still think about that. And nothing happened. And it was, you know, a beautiful piece and a beautiful night. But I think about that. You know, I think about that. Especially in light of, you know, so much of what has happened since these projects took place in 2018. So I'm going to finish up soon, actually. Let me see what my next slide is. Okay. So I do have a video of a project that I did at Berkeley, and it can just play in the background a little bit. So this is with the composer and D-Day American artist Raven Chacon, who was in a group show at the Berkeley Art Museum called Undoing Time. And this was a group show that worked with 12 different artists and commissioned them to do new projects around archives of incarceration. So Raven had a sound piece that he had constructed, again, from his own archives, the different archives of prisons, but it had to be within a constricted space, and I had to have these two walls built. And because Berkeley is in Northern California and on an active seismic fault line, we were very limited as to like our wall construction ability. So we couldn't take his original piece, and through a series of meetings, again, less than 6 months from the opening, the other co-curator said, well, you're gonna have to commission him to do a new piece. And I was like, well, okay, let's talk to him and see what commission means. And he was actually incredibly clear and said, I've always wanted to do a concert on Alcatraz. Alcatraz is a former prison and a former military site. It's you know, if you've ever seen that Clint Eastwood movie, Birdman, I don't know if Clint Eastwood, it's a famous film called Birdman of Alcatraz, where they try to leave and, you know, flee the island, but it's surrounded by all these currents and all these, you know, dangerous geological formations, and like it's very difficult to leave this island, which is in the San Francisco Bay. So what sounded like a simple request was not the easiest thing, because Alcatraz is now a huge like tourist attraction, and it was still during COVID, and we didn't have any contacts. I had a few friends who were artists who had worked on Alcatraz, but anyway, in the end though, we were able to actually contact someone who was, you know, amenable to an art project, and we had to then figure out where at Alcatraz we would do a sound performance. And one of the places that actually is not on the public tour is the old hospital and old infirmary. And when we proposed this, Raven was like, this is where I want to do the project, and you know, I want to take what was formerly, you know, a site of incarceration, but that was a space of care, and try to like present my. So I guess I'll just end by saying that you know, my takeaway from this was that I didn't intend to do a performance with this project, but performance comes to you sometimes, and that is what the practice does, is that you get thrown these things that are opportunities, and you kind of have to go with them and like take a risk and put yourself forward, and just move ahead with that spirit of sort of like bravery and see what happens. So I'll leave that at that, and then look forward to hearing something else.
Ricky, maybe you could end with the last slide of Christina because we have our questions there. So we can keep them during Chrissy's and Tom's talk. Thank you, Christina. I think there are a lot of questions, but we will have the questions at the end. So I'd like to continue with Christy.
Oh, you too. Whichever.
Thank you, and hi everyone. Thanks for coming tonight, and very happy to be on this panel. I'm going to just pull the lens back a little bit to just read out a few notes about the current situation and what reimagining institutions could, art institutions could look like. We're in the middle of a geopolitical, ethical, social, technological, and climate crisis that's brought us to a precipice. And at the same time, a major generational shift is taking place, and that's making the nature and the stakes of this precipice sharply visible. And the cultural response to this increasingly unviable hegemonic condition of genocide, war, precarity, excess, and impending ecological collapse is taking what could be described as a kind of archipelagic turn, of course, which is the opposite of a kind of that totalizing global power and settler colonialism we're seeing right now. And the archipelagic, of course, is a concept articulated by Glissant, the Martinican poet, writer, and philosopher. And this kind of rhizomatic structure of relation that he talks about, with interlapping layers of connectivity and interdependence, which is really sort of critical now. This, in my opinion, is where the future of art institutions lies. And of course, when we say art institutions, what do we mean? There are so many different kinds, from museums with collections whose parameters can stretch from 5,000 years plus BCE to the present, to non-collecting, independent, non-profit exhibition spaces, to artist-run spaces, focused on contemporary art and young artists, and everything in between. And of course, the specific context of art institutions varies widely from country to country. This is just one of many, not the most important, maybe one of the large ones and the very powerful one, but in this archipelagic thinking, America is no more important than anywhere else. And all this varies, of course, from continent to continent, but we're all inextricably linked. And this rhizomatic structure is that I'm sort of suggesting as a way forward is both local and global. And so in my thinking, each kind of institution has different strengths. And so all of us, if we work together, can offer different things and contribute different things. And one thing I think the current situation has created is a real fear of communicating honestly or communicating directly at all. And there's a deep caution about what can and cannot be said, which I find deeply disturbing. And that's heightened by the sort of rather bad-tempered, sometimes violent, and disproportionate response, especially online and on social media, to something that someone else happens to disagree with. The tendency to disappear behind screens, literal and metaphorical, deepened by 2 years plus of a pandemic whose impact we're still coming to terms with and understanding, has created a new level of mistrust between us and fear that can only be countered by an in-person sociality, like this one, that's both inclusive and empathetic. Empathic, maybe. And as the pandemic subsides, we're experiencing what Miguel Miguel describes as an increase in the degree and extension of authoritarian regimes as a mode of planetary management. P. Staff, the artist, describes this current crisis as a crisis of capitalism, which is a crisis of reproduction, which is a crisis of gender and race. And what's remarkable about trans aesthetics, he says, now is its relationship to and inhabiting of this flashpoint of crisis. The veil of the real, the privatized bourgeois family, the nation state tearing itself apart, maybe what makes trans aesthetics pertinent now is an unrepentant capacity to make and invert the world as we know it, theoretically, politically, and corporally. And so that sense of inversion, which from Pea's perspective as a trans person, I see as something very useful to think about in terms of a way forward. So how might we all imagine or reimagine art institutions and their relationship to each other in the midst of this intensifying, suffocating environment? Art institutions in New York are uniquely positioned to explore this idea of creating an inter-institutional structure of communication. There are the large museums, of course, my own, the Whitney Museum, MoMA, the Met, the Guggenheim, the Brooklyn Museum. There are non-collecting institutions, such as PS1 and the New Museum, and independent artist-focused spaces, such as Artist Space, Participant, Triple Canopy, eFlux, White Columns, Blank Forms, Abrams Art Center, Canal Projects, Brick Art Center, Anthology Film Archives, Light Industry, Performance Space, Union Docs, and many more. And we create the cultural fabric of this city all together, and none of us are more important than the other. All those independent spaces have as much impact as museums, and galleries, private galleries make their contribution too, and also university and art school gallery spaces such as Hunter, the Wallack Gallery, Lenfest, the NYU galleries. A good example is the newly opened show Materials of Solidarity, curated by Nadine Fatala, which has just opened at NYU's Asian Pacific American Institute. We are all needed, and each institution is creating different possibilities for future change. All of us serve different, sometimes overlapping publics, and most of us work directly with artists and with social justice and educational institutions across the city, with different projects, art projects, and also through our education departments. Cultural spaces are critical and essential to a healthy society. So how can we nurture them? How can we transform them? Well, it's a process, and it's in constant forward motion. The Whitney I work in now is completely different from the Whitney I worked in 6 years ago. There is so much more communication now. We are so much more advanced and sophisticated in the way we communicate with each other and think together and what we do. So it's a constantly evolving, it's a process. And so we do this, we transform by coming together and learning how to disagree with each other civilly. And I really believe in that very strongly. And so it's through that kind of collective coming together that relations to power, identity, and history can be renegotiated. And it has to happen both within the institution itself and outwards with the public and with each other. This is the way we can construct civic social space. In our biennial that just closed, Meg Onley and I tried to create a space that Lygia Lewis observed when she was listening to us talking about it with her. She said, well, it sounds like you're making a dissonant chorus. And that dissonant chorus that we made was one in which visitors were brought into the middle of conversations between artists and artworks that had many different priorities and focuses, from questions of the real, to war, genocide, colonial histories, notions of unfixity, and material and perceptual contingency. So the viewer experienced the process and intimacy of being inside that chorus, listening to each voice, and witnessing the entanglement of cultural values being negotiated in those in-between spaces where contradictory interests conjoin. And so in this moment of intense social, psychic, geographic destabilization, severe global migrant and climate crisis, everything I mentioned before, the genocide, and intense social and political disagreement, the anxieties opened up by AI as well, and seismic shifts in geopolitical power, we have no choice but to rethink what our role can be as cultural institutions. As Glissant argued, the breaking apart of established modes by which community is constituted are making it increasingly difficult for originary narratives and founding myths to hold. Roots are undone, he said, and worked into a new political and cultural fabric. And this, I think, is what we're going through at the moment. So within the acute totalizing conditions of neoliberal global capitalism and continuing settler colonialism, how could this kind of archipelagic thinking function critically as a framework to think post-continentally, asserting survivance and reconfiguring new interlapping adjacencies and relationships between us? So I'll just finish by saying a little bit about what I do at the museum. I'm a curator who curates exhibitions and also builds the collection. The part of the collection I build is the moving image part of the collection, and museums who collect not only bring works into the collection, but they research those works, preserve them, interpret them, exhibit them, and also educate both the public and we are scholarly research institutions. And this, we play, I think, a really important role in relation to the independent institutions that I was mentioning earlier. And, I work with them all the time. So just to give you an example of something I'm currently working on, I'm working on several different layers of history all at once. 2020 and Black Lives Matter, the civil rights movement, the intersection between 2020 and Black Lives Matter, the civil rights movement, Black Power and Black feminism in the 60s and 70s, the impact of the Vietnam War on a generation of Vietnamese American artists, social movements in the East Village in the 60s and 70s, and up in Harlem, and really sort of creating a kind of multivalent historical context within the collection, and also working on future shows that really starts to kind of look at the relationship between what was going on in the 60s during that period of the civil rights movement and the cultural impetuses that led to afterwards in 64, 65, and again in 68. And then also how those relate to what's going on now. And so we, as an institution that historicizes, can actually also work with smaller institutions to build something, also in relation to archives. And we have a collection, we have a special collection, and we have a library and archives. And the archivists and the archives are extremely important ways to also kind of renegotiate those power structures, because of course a painting is no more valuable than a film or a poster or a zine. And so that's the approach that I take, this very sort of horizontal approach that allows these different relationships between different parts of institutional histories that are constantly being reconfigured and rethought and discussed, both internally but also with colleagues and scholars and everyone who works in institutions like Participant, etc., so that you actually map out histories and rethink histories in relation also to what our education department in our case does, which is very extensive, working with a number of different social justice organizations throughout the city. So that's just some thoughts for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Christy. I'd like to continue with Tom.
Hey everybody. So I have spoken, I'm writing a book about North American art museums with my friend Pablo Helguera, and we're writing this book about museums in Mexico, the United States, and Canada, sort of for comparison. And I found myself talking about this book often. I gave a museum studies class at Queens College last semester, and at the end of the semester I said, how many people in this room want to work in museums? And nobody raised their hands, because I think I had poisoned them to the museum because of how critical I was. So I feel like now I have to start talking about this by saying I love museums. Museums have been transformational in my life, but I think that there's a big problem in museums. And museums are, these spaces that were basically founded around class differentiation. I think that at their core, they're colonialist, sexist, racist, ableist, and for sure classist. So I want to just say that and say some of the things that we're talking about in our book to try to figure out. So our book is going to be very prescriptive. So we have a series of discussions about systems in Mexico, United States, and Canada. What can we learn both north and south of the border with these different kinds of systems? And I will say, I'm a public sector guy. As you mentioned, I was Commissioner of Cultural Affairs. We have a very large cultural budget in New York City. But when we interviewed Mexican museum directors, where it's 100% publicly funded, they say this is a disaster that you have to try to avoid. Because every time there's an election, even if it's the same party, everybody gets fired. And you have a new set of museum directors and you can't plan. You want to have some division. At the same time, I think that we've realized more than ever right now that we have to detach ourselves from the plutocrats that are running our country. If you look at what just happened with pulling the plug on endorsing a highly problematic but highly preferable candidate at the Washington Post and the LA Times, there's a problem right now that we're in the new Gilded Age. The Gilded Age is when museums were born. The Whitney, which I love, and I'm going to be organizing a show there in February, so no anti-Whitney statement here. The richest person in the world was a guy named Cornelius Vanderbilt. His granddaughter was Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney. He was one of the robber barons of the worst period of labor, abuse, and division of wealth until now. We're in a situation now where we are back to that kind of division of labor. So how will we pull the plug on some of the power, especially what's happening right now in relationship to Gaza, to what's happening in terms of division between staffs and directors, even at the boards of directors of cultural institutions. So I don't want to go into all the problems, but I want to talk about 3 different ways that we think that Pablo and I are going to recommend. At the end of our book, we're going to have 10 recommendations. And by the way, so right now, there are a lot of people who are sort of the abolitionist flank of the museum critics. And these are people who basically feel that we should just close museums and make them into affordable housing or public schools. And I actually have a lot of sympathy with that, but I do not subscribe to that. I think we should have museums, and I think a better analogy rather than closing or keeping it open, in environmental, ecological terminology, there's this reduce, reuse, recycle. So reduce would be, let's say, the abolitionist position. Let's reduce the number of museums to 0. A kind of mild way of changing museums would be recycle. Recycling is great, I'm for it, but you start with a plastic container and you recycle it back into another plastic container. So we're talking about, in our book, this question of can museums be reused? So fundamental change without destruction of the museum, because we believe in museums. So let me just go through a couple of different ways that we're recommending to change museums. And the first has to do with money. So we have this problem right now, which has to do with, toxic philanthropy. And one of the questions right now is, where is your endowment invested? And all across the board, you have billions and billions of dollars invested, and there's one divestment move after another, most of which I support. I was a part of a sit-in when I was in college to divest from South Africa, so I believe in divestment. But divestment is a never-ending cycle, because as soon as you divest from Arms for Israel, petrochemicals, and big pharma, you're still investing in, abusive animal agriculture. So another way of investing is it's what's called mission-driven investing. Rather than saying we're going to start with a set of investments and start taking away and divesting, what do we believe in and what are we for? And let's invest in that. So it could be green technology, it could be investing in parts of the cities that were, divested from through redlining. That's called mission-driven investing, and you can do it. And there are now funds available for museums, and there are some museums who are beginning to sign up for this, to say, we're going to invest in what we believe in. There are other financial models, and again, I'm a public sector, advocate. I've sued government twice in my life. So I don't think that we should have full government support, but does anybody here know what city in America has the highest per capita funding for the arts? So by far the biggest cultural affairs department is New York, but does anybody know the per capita? See if somebody say San Francisco? Yes? Yes, I heard San Francisco, yes. Yes, correct. And do you know why San Francisco has that amount of money for culture?
Because they have percent of the budget
Hotel tax. So what happened in San Francisco, there was an informal connection. By the way, congratulations if you get it right. I think it's important that people understand this kind of shit, honestly. So there was a time in which my friend, again, Tom McCagney, was head of cultural affairs for San Francisco, and there was a push to connect the hotel tax to the public funding for the arts, and it didn't quite win, and so then they put forward another, the city put forward their version. I think 3/4 of the city of San Francisco, of the citizens, voted for a very large assessment, which is a percentage of the hotel tax. So that ended up with a high, and it was also a moment at which they were able to redistribute money to more organizations and communities of color. So I'm for that. I think we should have a dedicated taxes. One of the taxes that's been discussed a lot is the secondary market tax. Sorry about that. But the secondary market tax, anybody heard of what a secondary, you know what a secondary market tax is, right? So we don't have a secondary market tax in the United States. But if you have a secondary market tax, you know, if you sell your work at a gallery and then it's resold at a gallery, the artist doesn't get anything. So there's a theorist who's proposing now the secondary market tax to go back to the artist. Some of the money go back to the artist and some of the money go to funding the arts. It'd be a new fund. I think we have to think about ways in which the richest people in America are not controlling our cultural institutions. One is the idea, again, of these kind of taxes, of big public funding. And then the other idea, so my wife is a curator, she was at the Brooklyn Museum, she did lots of shows, and a lot of them were sort of conceptual, you know, art. But anybody ever heard of KAWS? You guys have heard of KAWS, right? No? I mean, he's like way more famous than all the artists that you have heard of, if you haven't heard of. What's that?
SVA graduate.
SVA graduate, yes.
Illustration department.
3 million followers on Instagram. So they did a show at KAWS, and that show sold out the bookshop every single day that the show was open. They made millions of dollars so that they could do We Wanted a Revolution Upstairs, which is a black feminist show, which was maybe the show that was at the heart of the curators in a different way. So earned income, there have been really great models of for-profit artists who have the highest degree of artistic imagination. There was a guy who had a theater company, it was for-profit. His name was William Shakespeare. You guys have heard of him, right? So why can't we think about art that's popular and ticket sales being a way to make money? So when I was Commissioner of Cultural Affairs, one of the things we did was we allowed the Metropolitan Museum to charge money for out-of-towners. New Yorkers, it's still free. Out-of-towners have to pay $25. Did you know that 1/3 of that money is being redistributed to arts organizations in low-income communities, mostly communities of colors across New York City? So every time an outsider comes in and pays that $25, which by the way, gave the Met an extra $10 million of income per year, 1/3 of the money is going out to East New York and Brownsville. It was a way to say, like, it's like the hotel tax. It's taxing people from out of town. It's easier to cut a tax, of course. All I'm saying with this part is we have to rethink money. We have to rethink where we're getting the money, and we have to think about ways to, again, take some of that power away from trustees. How much time do I have? I got 2 more propositions. Okay.
7 o'clock.
7 o'clock now, okay. I'll say quickly. So, do you guys know, have you ever heard of the term, the Overton window? Anybody? Yes? Do you want to say what it is? No.
Spectrum of available political ideas.
Spectrum of political ideas that are acceptable for politicians to talk about. So there's, you know, so this guy named Overton came up with the Overton window. And it's just called the Overton window because they named after him. So it's my belief that artists have a wider Overton window than other people in the art world. That artists can come up with crazy ideas that would be unacceptable for a curator to come up with. And in the book, we have a variety of artists we're talking to. One is Fred Wilson, who went to the Maryland Historical Society and just blew the place open in terms of the idea of how racist that place was. And I just don't think a curator could have done that at that time. I think now curators can because Fred Wilson opened the door for that. Another example was Tanya Bruguera came to us at the Queens Museum and first said, I want to start a political party for immigrants. And we said, well, you can't do that because we'll lose our nonprofit status. You can't run a political party out of a museum. She then said, I want to do a project that's going to last 7 years and I have to have a place off-site and you're going to fund the whole thing. We did. No curator could have come to me and said, off-site, we're going to start a community center with no particular measurables, which created incredible community cohesion. Anyway, those are examples of the fact that museums need to listen to artists in very fundamental ways and not just give an artist a project, but give artists power to do transformative projects. Because I think artists are, you know, one of the last hopes we have in our society for people who are allowed to think freely. And then the third thing, which may be the most annoying for this panel, is that I believe that what got us into the situation we are now, aside from the money, the people who have engineered the museum as it is now are curators. So the people who have become directors over the last second half of the 20th century have been trained curators. They've been trained mostly in art history, and this is changing. And I believe curators should continue to become directors. I'm for that. I'm not against it. I'm a curator. My wife's a curator, blah, blah, blah. I don't hate curators. But I think that there are other people in museums who have other kinds of ideas that need to be empowered. And an example I would give is a woman named Jackie Tarassa. Do you know Jackie?
Yeah, very well.
So she was, did you work with her?
I worked on projects with her.
So she
Yeah,
was an
very well.
education director at Art Institute of Chicago, deputy at the Met. And she's now running a museum at Colby College. And that museum is being run in a way I feel that is the way a museum educator would run a museum. They have an offsite, they have artist studios, which I think curators would also favor. But they have a research institute, and it's being run in a way that's so multifaceted in terms of who they're listening to, because education departments are trained to listen to the public. You know, that education departments listen to kids, they listen to seniors, they listen to museum security, etc. So I think that one of the things that we're talking about, we have a section of the book, which is to say we need to look for new leaders in new parts of the museum. So I guess I'll leave it with that. I will say that one other recommendation, which I was add on my sheet, was looking for different kind of expertise, not just in the directorial, but at the Queen's Museum we hired community organizers to be on our staff. These are not outreach people. These are people who have been doing political organizing or housing organizing, etc., in the communities we're working in. So that when COVID hit and Corona Queens was experiencing food shortages, they opened a food pantry because the community organizer lived in the community, knew the people who needed the food, and knew the people who were distributing the food, and the people distributing the food didn't have a facility to do it. They served food to 100,000 families. There were sometimes 1,000 people lining up for food at the museum. And I thought that was a moment in which, and again, that, by the way, the director at the Queen's Museum, Sally Talent, is another person coming out of education. She was oriented towards community service, and having community organizers on staff was an important new twist on the kind of expertise you want to bring into museums. Anyway, so those are just some of our recommendations.
Thank you.
It's interesting because I would say that Jeffrey Valance is an example of the Overton window, because in 2004 his project, working with the students of the CCA, California College of the Arts curatorial program, was to start a campaign to get the money from secondary sales into the hands of artists and museums. So their project wasn't an exhibition, it was actually a campaign to do that. So, good Overton window example. All right, so my images are just gonna scroll around, so I'm not gonna do next. If you just push below, perfect. And I am just going to read something. My kind of addition to this is thinking about reflexivity. What if we were to imagine a reflexive museum? We've heard about, there's a lot of talk about generative practices, relational practices, relational museums, like artist-centered or artist-focused. So just to put another kind of word in there, I started thinking about reflexivity because it kind of takes responsibility within the institution itself and within the people if you have reflexive thinking. So what would it mean to develop a reflexive museum? By this I mean one that is responsive to the social, political and cultural context in which it functions, as well as to the historical precedents of 19th and 20th century museums. The term is borrowed from social theory, where concepts of reflexive modernity suggest that as a result of the gradual disintegration of simple modernity, namely the institutional structures of industrial society, such as civil rights, universal suffrage, public education, healthcare, the welfare system, and so on, a process of modernization is taking place. This relates less to self-reflection than to a reflex, an action that is performed in response to a stimulus, which arises through alienation from the impact of previous bureaucratic systems. As opposed to post-modernity, The reflexive alternative is based on the notion that modernity as a process is not yet over. Instead, it is evolving through societal changes brought on by the fruition of the first wave of modernity's so-called ideals, in the face of transnational forces such as corporations and NGOs, and through the rise of individualization as traditional forms of solidarity, such as political, religious, or family ties, collapse. This is happening in part because of economic and cultural globalization, and also as a result of the liberation from modern institutions as they begin to fail the populations that they were established to serve. In this gap, people are initiating alternative structures to circumnavigate the hierarchies of power and harness a surplus of human resources. And you've heard examples of that from other people here. The resulting new social movements operate alongside the mainstream configurations of modern society, often relating to global issues, from, for example, ecology to civil rights, on a local networked basis. To consider reflexivity in relation to the museum as a modern construct, it would follow that new formations would acknowledge shared genealogy with the 19th and 20th century public museums as instruments for democratic education, for cultivating the masses, that care for public collections, that's the 19th century kind of examples, or as places for connoisseurship, specialization and discourse, as laboratories for experimentation, as vehicles for visual spectacle, which is the 20th century model. But it would be recognized that some functions are becoming obsolete or being exploited. In its overarching purpose, however, the museum is not yet exhausted. I agree with you, Tom. There is no post-museum as yet. Logically, the reflexive museum will be created by those who no longer feel beholden to traditional institutional mechanisms, who feel at liberty to be receptive to the constituencies they operate within. They would focus on addressing issues of national and international relevance locally, while building networks and collaborations with like-minded organisations around the world. This is kind of upper pyramid. They would not be bound to the bureaucracies of larger scale state or federal mandates, instead drawing on infrastructural and financial resources that support the particular intentions of the museum. Driven by the impetus to be flexible and proactive, their form of governance would be reflected in the diversity of workforce who produce the programs. This is if it was a reflexive museum. Where the term new institutionalism gained traction at the end of the 1990s, early 2000s, as a way to describe the reshaping of mostly Northern European Kunsthallen and how they could transform the production of contemporary culture for small, specialised constituencies. And this is what Tom was saying with the kind of curator taking the helm. The Reflexive Museum operates with a broader public in mind. Through the impact of globalisation, as infrastructures and emerging art world geographies shift from the biennial model to the institutional, the Reflexive Museum is a cogent framework. Untethered from Western traditions and assumptions, it is free to borrow from, mix, or regenerate all previous museological configurations. In particular, by developing outside established art centres, it can more readily adapt to the outcomes of deterritorialisation, to steal from Deleuze and Guattari, to reflect the new sense of conjoined cultural proximity and distance. Unlike the late capitalist museum, with its emphasis on scale, spectacle, interactivity, and entertainment, weighted in history, the Reflexive Museum, as a 21st century proposition, operates fluidly within the present stages of technological evolution. As such, social practices, which increasingly influence and drive the museum, will no longer be associated with the immediacies of context, shaped as much by the everywhere of remote culture as they are the local. Amidst omnipresent mediatization, new imaginaries of the laboratory can be introduced. Pedagogy can dematerialize, while the pursuit and problematization of objective knowledge, particularly in relation to overlooked or underrepresented actors, is reinstated as a meaningful endeavour. Through the reappraisal of historically entrenched classifications and terminologies, the canon of art is questioned. By rejecting the influence of the inflated art market, what constitutes value is questioned, what constitutes cultural authority is contested, what constitutes a collection is reassessed. The end. My timing with the slides wasn't quite right, but we can just, they're kind of generic, it'll give you something to look at.
So what's to go detail after media? Do you want
No.
to? No. All right.
Thank you so much. It was actually extremely rich. So we have actually so many questions probably. But now I don't want to be too selfish because I already gave you some questions to begin with. So I'd like to use the time for our audience first, if you know, if there are questions coming. Otherwise, I will jump in. You can revisit your thoughts about any. Yeah.
So my question is about projects that maybe have vocational applications that are involved in museums. Museums tend to, in my mind, be kind of these very lofty places where a young person probably can't imagine themselves at a talk like tonight. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on like industry. If like I know there's a robot outside of the Museum of Hip Hop that's going to be opening that was like a welding project. Do you have any examples or insights into how like youth in a artistic way, like building something that could be a skill that's not necessarily, sorry, they're not talking to the mic, it's not necessarily art per se, but has value to the real needs of the community?
So before the turn of the 20th century, a lot of American museums did that a lot. There were educational institutions, they had schools, they were teaching people how to be a good designer. The Met was like that, Philadelphia Museum was like that. And things changed because the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston sort of took over ideologically this idea of the aesthetic museum. So what you're describing is what museums were. And there's different models actually coming from Britain. There was sort of more the educational side. Maybe you guys could talk about that more. But, so there are museums now who are considering themselves, and so by the way, the people who are doing that a lot are libraries. Libraries have users, they're understood to be useful in the life of everyday New Yorkers. They have the same overall attendance as the museums in New York, but it's New Yorkers and it's working class people, it's people trying to change their life. So at the Queens Museum when I was there, we did have lots of classes, things like, you know, how to write code in Mandarin, or, you know, how to become a DJ in Spanish. That one, by the way, it was incredible. Museum directors dream almost. There were fights to get into that class. It's like, oh my God, this is great. But it was, the idea was to actually start at libraries with 4 classes and then come to museum for 4 classes. And all the classes were things that were going to be useful in the life of the community. And if the class wasn't filling, we didn't do it again. It was the people's choice. And if people wanted us to run a particular class. So what you're saying, doing stuff that's useful, creating skills, is something museums absolutely should be doing. That they did in the past, they still continue to do it. But I think they need to do it more, and I think they would do it more partially if museum directors sometimes came from the education department, where that kind of thing is embraced.
Can I add on to that? There's a kind of extended version of that, which is that what if you were to change the people that were actually running the museums completely outside of those that run education, and it was something that I became very interested in at PS1. Because at the moment, it's possible to get internships in the curatorial department, highly competitive, or in the communications department. But what if you were actually to go out and to start to bring different people into the museum to train so they could have the jobs and start making the decision as to what was going to happen and start changing the way. So rather than it being kind of useful classes that you can then leave with because you were a visitor, what if you were actually having the chance to be employed and to work alongside the art handlers and to be employed for that, so that you start to change the culture of who gets those jobs in the first place, and it's not a degree entry after you've done your master's or your BA, but there's another kind of path through on all levels of the museum.
Nice. So we actually did something like that at the Queens Museum also, which was we had guards, security guards, licensed security guards. We also had gallery sitters, and the gallery sitters were folks who were, it was an employment program. So it was people who were sort of learning about museums. It's still going on, yeah. So the learning about museums with the goal of getting into being an art educator and working into the jobs. So there were a lot of people in Queens who didn't, who might have had lots of skills and lots of languages that they spoke, but didn't have entry into the jobs until we sort of and that so it would be paid to sit in the galleries, they're still there, but move into the education jobs. Yeah.
So, I'm always trying to think about like a practical answer to your question, like what could be possible within, like my life as an employee at a museum, so to speak. It's like and so I think your question begs the thinking about the leadership of the museum and like are they supportive of this basically like a mission focus and a kind of like staffing kind of focus. And so I mean the example I'm going to give is actually I do think museums having made the shift in the last 10 years to have their internships be paid is actually a tremendous like positive like space that actually this question of having like why do the internships have to be about training future museum staff? Why couldn't it just be about the museum staff, being a giving institution, being a teaching institution, and have anyone who wanted to be in that space like be paid to learn? So I think there's, I think Chrissy's point about staff being in conversation with each other about what are the possibilities and how we can rethink the way in which we are a public institution, would be the direction that supporting a vocational kind of like thinking of ourselves as civic servants and thinking of ourselves like what can we give and what can we be paid to give and what can we be paid to be to be part of this community. So I do think it's all of these things. It's sort of like the leadership, it's the colleagues coming together, and it's I mean again the way I've seen sort of like little minute changes happen within institutions that is if you actually look at the work that you're already doing and think about how can we shift that work and open it up a little bit. So it's not initially about asking for more budget, more staff, more space on the calendar. It's actually about doing the work differently. So I would say, in response to your question, absolutely yes. But I think it's about having the leadership and the conversation and looking at your resources and thinking about this is how we want our museum to operate.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
How many of you, following what Tom asked in another room, how many of you actually want to work in museums?
Or be a curator.
That's great.
50-50 or a little more? 100%? Okay, good.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Can I add something to the conversation?
Do you want to get to the mic?
Mike.
Yeah.
First, let's hear
Step up
from,
to the mic, as they say in the kids'
let's hear
Oh.
from Chrissy too, and then you can.
Yeah, as you're walking, Chrissy.
As you're walking, I'll just maybe add that if you have, say, a science museum or a museum of, there are so many museums that are not art museums. I think that there are different ways in which art museums can't do everything, and I think what's interesting and what we're not really talking about, but to Tom's point about class, which I mentioned coming from Britain, curatorial meetings all the time, because I'm just so struck by how class-ridden America is that education, you have to pay for education in the US. I mean, this is a bizarre idea, and this kind of elitism within the education system, which starts at the age of even before 5 years old. People are sort of struggling to get their kids into kindergarten. I mean, it means that by the time you get to studying art history or doing curatorial courses, it's a real issue. And so I think that in terms of education and the education system's relationship to museums are picking up the slack of an education system that is pretty inadequate and really fails the majority of people. And that's a question as well, because museums should absolutely be doing all the things that have been mentioned, but at the same time, the education system from 5 years old to when you go to college should also be, there are no art, they don't teach art in secondary schools in New York City. I don't know about other states, but it's bizarre. If you want to learn music, if you want to learn the arts in general, it's a massive problem, the education system in America, like the health system. And so, there has to be a kind of broader also questioning of how issues of class and access to learning, how educational institutions in general can also address that as well as museums. Just go into.
Is it on?
My name is Valerie Beauvais, and I'm a high school teacher in Queens. And we have the Whitney has a robust program for students, and the Guggenheim. Most of the museums have internship programs. They've got writing programs. For high school students, and sometimes for one of my students actually. She went through the Youth Insights program, multiple levels, and we went through the final stage where she was a youth leader, and they worked on writing projects and they worked on visual art projects. They learned how to, run events at the Noguchi Museum. I had a student do one of the programs there. They learned how to run Gozo tours. They created artwork. They planned events for other high school students. And then one of my students went through the whole program at the Whitney, and then she had an internship at the Guggenheim, and she found her own internship at the Princeton Archaeological Museum, and then she's studying. She got a BA in art history, and now she's studying museum design exhibitions. So.
But can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So I think what Chrissy said, which is, as I understand it, in New York City public school system. In grade school, they're meeting state standards pretty well. In middle school, not so well. In high school, really not well at all. You're a high school
Yes, it's a
art
Catholic
teacher.
school.
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, okay, all right.
And so, but.
But this is the thing is that I think what you're saying is so important, and I didn't realize that so you could find exceptions, and your student sounds exceptional, but overall, we have to fight for more public school art teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And people hate De Blasio. I worked very close to De Blasio. He added 100 new certified full-time art teachers every year. And that was his biggest aspect of his whole arts initiative. It wasn't the Department of Cultural Affairs, although we did have the largest budgets in the history of New York, adjusted for inflation. But the biggest thing was getting art back into the public school system. And it's a disgrace. It really is. And so all of these issues we're talking about with museums, if people aren't prepared from working class families in New York City to come, where are we at, right? And it's all great, and I'm pro-education programs as well. But it's things like that, and then CUNY is radically underfunded. Most CUNY students don't pay, But who's going to Albany and fighting for the budget of CUNY, and who's fighting for the budget for the arts in this public school system?
But that's also because
Did
America.
you ask your question?
She was like,
Oh, it's just a comment. I thought you had a question.
Yes, I just wanted to applaud museums for their programs.
Well, I was just thinking that, I completely agree with you, Tom, and the trouble with America is it's such an individualistic society. So the goal is that you arrive here poor, you make a lot of money, and then, it's called the 1% because only 1% of people become wealthy. And yet, so the 99%, the society isn't made for the 99%. It's made for the 99% to try to be the 1%. But education is actually not something that's a priority because then you question too much. And so, the system actually works perfectly because the system is designed for the 1%. So it's functioning perfectly because it perpetuates that
But
whole
Chrissy,
sort of
you're-
cycle.
You're also a newcomer to the States, and things weren't this bad 30 years ago, 40 years ago. When I got to Hunter College as a graduate student, they just had started charging tuition 2 years before I got there, and it was free. When I went, it was almost completely free, and it's still mostly free for most people, CUNY. But we're not aware of and supporting. So it hasn't always been this way. It's much worse. We're exactly to where we were 120 years ago with division of wealth. We're in the new Gilded Age right now. And as disgraceful as that was, and it took the labor movement, it took tax law that created the income tax, it took effort by progressives who were united to redistribute the wealth. And in the middle of the century, the distribution was quite different than it is now when I was a kid. So Make America Great Again with 70% marginal income tax for rich people, right? That's what it was like when I was a kid.
There's something to be said about doing things one by one. Like the most effective ways that I've worked out how to work is actually like, because the amount there's organisations like Artistic Noise. There's many different organisations like this in the city which are supporting justice impacted youth. You can get 12 of them together and take them through a programme, but if you don't actually spend time individually with those people and give them reinforcement and support, like over time, you know, it's not going to change, because there are no. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about a museum or an education system. It doesn't change unless people are actually given. So, but if everybody was to decide to support, like somebody who wanted to kind of break through into this kind of system, then it would be possible. You're just going to decide that you're actually going to do the work.
Here's the funny thing though, America leads the field and has done for quite some time. Civil rights, feminism, Black Lives Matter. I mean, America is this incredibly conservative and very sort of radical for sort of pushing forward kind of paradox. And so, you know, museums, all of which except the Smithsonian are private in this country, are trying to create a sort of civic space within this push-pull of where there's no public civic space. I mean, you know, Kate and I and 55 million other people own everything in the Tate. Everything in the Tate's collection belongs to us and everyone else, the entire population. It's a sort of really interesting shift when you come to America to think that if you are in a museum, you're sort of in someone's house and you never feel like you're in a public place, really. And you know, it's an odd situation, and yet the extraordinary art that comes out of America, the extraordinary educational initiatives, the things that museums do, are looked at by the rest of the world. So this is a paradox. America's collapsing, and yet the cultural situation is very vibrant, and the pushback is very strong. And what happens in educational institutions and in museums is actually something that others look to from other parts of the world. So there's the paradox.
Yes, there's a question.
There's
Yeah,
two
might have to come to the mic.
I
Hi,
have a question.
Somebody has.
Abbas. Yeah.
And then there's one here.
Yeah.
So my question, as a curator, as a student of this department, as a student of curating in general, my question has to do within the sphere of curatorial agency a bit, but more directly about the visibility of what the visibility of a curator should be. So Christina, you started with the responsibility of a curator, that we are now probably, we have more responsibility than ever before. And I was thinking, when a layperson is going to an exhibition, we are not aware of the curator as much as the works of the artists. We have the curator still at the back pulling the strings, not in a bad way, but say for example, a biennale, like Chrissy, you just did the biennial, so whatever critiques, good, bad, came for you, not the artists in general, because you were the creator of the biennial. Adriano Pedrosa faced the same thing, whether good, bad, the criticism, the critiques came for Adriano Pedrosa. So a layperson going to an exhibition, if the work is bad, they leave. Even if the exhibition is bad, they leave with a bad taste for the artist, not the curator. So going into this future, what visibility should the curator have? Like, should the curator have more of a visible face, and does that come with powers that a curator should not have? or are we moving towards a future where the curator is as much of a creative role as the artist, just in a different field?
I think that, you know, when you curate a show, you're curating for many different publics. I think if you walk through the Venice Biennale, whether you agree with the premise of the show or not, whether you think it's a successful show or not, I don't think that, I mean, the art it has to stand up for itself. So I think that if a curator is criticized for a show, whatever that show is, you know, sometimes the artworks are also criticized. And sometimes the curator is criticized for the idea, but the artworks are not. And so I think it's very complex. I don't think, personally, the kind of cult of the curator, that's a very sort of early 2000s idea. It's not something that interests me. I think, you know, every show is different. It depends on your relationship, the relationship between the curators and the artists. I would question the biennial structure. There are 300 biennials in the world. You have 11 months to do it. How can you make something meaningful in 11 months, especially when there are 299 other biennials around? You know, I think biennials should become triennials, just to, you know, throw that out there, because I think that would give everyone more time. And Cecilia's Venice Biennale was very well thought of, and that's partly because she had more time. She had double the time. So I think it's a complicated question. I think that, you know, curators have, aside from issues of taste, which is an entire panel in itself, I think that the ideas that curators bring together, it's, you know, shows are very relational. The show that Meg and I made was a show about relations, and relationality of the works in the show and the artists and the dialogues we had with them, but also bringing them together with each other in dialogue. You know, there are many critiques of the biennial that, you know, maybe the biennial wasn't for old white men. Maybe it was for, you know, different audiences. The majority of our show was, you know, artists of color and queer and trans. So, you know, it depends on the show, on the curators, on the artists, on the ideas, and I've forgotten what the question was. But anyway, yeah, I don't think curators should be really very visible. I think they should really be in the background.
You have the mic.
Hi, thank you guys so much for the talk today. And my question kind of relates to the previous discussion between Tom and Christy, and it relates to the overall problem of accessibility to the art world, as well as art's contribution to social justice. So I am a recent graduate from Columbia University, and I majored in art history and visual arts. And me, as well as a bunch of my other friends, saw a huge issue in accessibility to art and the lack of resources that nonprofits have to initiate social change in that aspect. So we decided to create a nonprofit organization in the recent months, especially viewing all the events that happened, especially on our own campus. And but we are sort of struggling to obtain grants, and we have kind of seen that like a lot of the grants that we've been looking at are like really not accepting new startup small profit non-profits, or like not so small scale nonprofits. So we were wondering if there is a better way for us to project our voices into the greater art world, and for us to showcase our ideas and kind of really able to make a change.
I'm going to open the question up a little bit more to like when I talk to students and I get asked, you know, how do I break into the field? How do I create a pathway and stuff? And so I don't know exactly what your organization is wants to do, or what kind of like visibility or support projects you want to support, but I typically would say that like as a student you have tremendous agency within your own, you know, university, and to, I mean, if you're a group of artists, to go to I mean, to, like you mentioned, the Wallach, to go to your home museum and your home curators and your home platforms to see if they will talk to student groups and to artists. I mean, I know that when I, having worked at Williams, having worked at Berkeley, knowing people who worked as a director at Colby, I mean, their job is to listen to students. And so if you're trying to look for outside support, you might not have as much, kind of like purpose to support you specifically as, someone who has a voice and someone who wants to do programming. But I guess that's my initial kind of question, but not knowing the specifics of what you're trying to accomplish.
Can you say what your group is trying?
Yeah,
is there
okay.
a particular niche, or what is the group about?
So we actually just got our 501c status, and our name is Surface Escape, and we are.
What?
We got our 501c status recently.
Yeah.
It's called Surface Escape. And so it's Surface, one E and an S, Escape. Yeah. And so we are a art organization that helps emerging young artists through promotion on social media. So we do artist interviews with emerging young artists in their studios, and we advertise them by posting on social media. And our goal is to do an annual exhibition every year, starting next year, to promote young artists' works and to bridge their young artists with the larger art world in that manner. And
Okay, so what I would say, with not knowing you or anything, but I'd give the same advice to anybody, you have to have a really specific reason why funders are going to fund you as opposed to other people. So there's other organizations around New York City that support young artists. There's a lot of them. There's a plethora, I would say. What's different about your organization? Do you have something? So when I was at the Queens Museum, we worked until we had a mission statement of one word, and the word was openness. And that was how we said, we are the organization that's open across lines of class, race, and very actively involved in the disability space. So, but that word, one word, so how do you boil it down to some very, very understandable thing that also differentiates you from everybody else, and then you become fundable? That's my...
And just very quickly, you haven't failed yet. You've barely started. And the amount of time that it takes to actually build, I'm sure most artists don't know that you exist either, and you haven't yet done a show. So it's a lot of this takes time, and it takes reiteration, and exactly. I mean, it takes a while to get down to one word.
But the problem with that is it's so freaking expensive to live in New York City right now, and that's a big, big problem for artists. And artists are leaving. It's really terrible. It's finally happening. When I was your age, I don't know how old you are, but when I was in my 20s, I was renting a loft with two other friends. We were each paying $150 a month. If you got a gig for $1,000, you could live off of it for 2 or 3 months without doing anything else because of real estate. And so that's the people destroying our city, I think, is the real estate interests. But it's also because we're a very successful city and a lot of people want to move here. So that's the big problem. So being patient, I agree 100% with what you're saying. It takes forever, it's a marathon and stuff. But how are you going to put food on the table as you are running this marathon is the big problem for you that wasn't there for me. I worked at PS1 through the 80s, the entire 80s. By the time I left PS1, I still wasn't making $20,000. And I mean, it's, multiply it times 2, but I was making very, very little money, but I had enough money to put food on the table. And that's the big problem.
thank you so much.
Hi, thanks to the panelists. These are topics I really care about. I've been, I guess, doing this since 2018. I remember seeing a panel here with Chrissy that Mike Peffy had organized forever ago. And I guess in that time, I've kind of noticed this trend of politics is getting really a lot worse, and museum programming is starting to prioritize trying to reproduce some remnants of the social democratic infrastructure. We're doing charity, we're doing food pantry type work. And connecting those two things, they're both kind of downstream of this lack of funding and this incredible consolidation of wealth at the top. And so I'm wondering, because all of y'all will have a lot more of this history available to you than I do, but what is unique about this period of American society that our elites are just so immensely wealthy, choose not to give to cultural institutions, which is kind of anomalous if you think of the Mellons and the Fricks and the robber barons of the 20th century, but also choose not to give back to the public, and that it's impossible to tax them because their wealth just, capital flight leaks everywhere else. So what is different about now that wasn't happening back then? Because we did have a good period after that. And so I'm just trying to understand what is different about today.
Take it away, Chrissy.
So I have to give a shout out to my trustees because they're actually incredibly generous, and we raised 700 million to move downtown so we could show more of our collection and do shows. Our trustees are incredibly generous, and I have to say that bringing works into the collection as I do, moving image works, including the gallery system is only one of many ways to bring moving image works. You can't lay out a history of the moving image art in America through the galleries because it's very partial, and so I bring in non-edition films, I bring in all kind of things, and my patrons and supporters, they say to me, I trust you, here's the money, and I bring in radical works, and they don't question it. So trustees are, I think, again, it's about communication and it's about trust, and they trust me, and I've been there a long time and they know me, and they will fund something I want to do and fund most of what we do incredibly generously and always without question. I mean, we tell them what the program is. They don't hear about it till it's all done. So I wouldn't say there's less funding than there was when I first joined the museum. In fact, there's more. I don't think that's really the issue. I think the issue is much broader, and it's to do with what Tom was saying about real estate, the fact that artists can't afford studio space, that there's a huge pressure on artists to make work for the market, much more so than in Europe. When the pandemic hit Germany, the government gave artists of the arts 5 billion euros, like that. And, all the artists here had to go on unemployment, and so they'd never received such a kind of steady income. But, I mean, artists are really struggling. They are leaving, Tom's right. And so it's more on that kind of level. I think there is money in museums. We have just got 2 grants for Free Fridays, Second Sundays. We've just got grants from patrons to allow us to give everyone under 25 free access to the museum, always. And Free Fridays, we're getting 5,000 people a night on Free Fridays. Very diverse audience, working class, diverse in every way. So, it's not really a question of patrons not, or philanthropy not being what it was. It's actually it's much more, and Tom knows much more about this than I, but it's much more to do with the climate, the political climate, the shifts, the way in which social media and the internet just kind of is very toxic and doesn't allow space to really let things air out. And I think that's the problem, not money. But you may just.
That's something he actually does way more about than I do. But I wanted to say, I don't think they're generous. I don't think these rich people are generous. And there's a book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded by Ruth Gilman. And she says, the money that ends up in a nonprofit has been stolen twice. It was stolen from the workers that created the wealth in the first place, and then it was stolen from the public sector because you're not paying taxes on that money. So all the money that you're putting into the Metropolitan Museum, and again, I'm doing a show at the Whitney, I'm not picking on Whitney, or the Whitney, has been stolen twice. So in the book that I'm working on, I'm also talking about so we do wealth acknowledgements in the book. So we do a wealth acknowledgement about Frick, about the Guggenheim, which is the great despoiler of the environment where you worked. And then the third is Crystal Bridges Museum, which is Walmart. So there is this abuse of labor happening, and now it's happening globally, not just locally. So the money that's being made on clothing at Walmart is a lot of stuff being made in Bangladesh. Does anybody know what the minimum wage is in Bangladesh today? Yes.
13 rupees a day.
Which is how much a month?
260 rupees a month.
Is how many dollars?
It is
roughly $4.5.
No. Not 4.5 million. It's $75 a month. Is the calculation I've heard. Not for, yeah.
Good, yeah.
Per month, okay. So that minimum wage, so my great aunt worked at a shirtwaist factory the year of the fire. She was not at that shirtwaist factory, but if you know the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, 100 young women died in that fire, including, the women like my immigrant great aunt. The minimum wage in New York City at that time, after the labor organizing by these women, after all those deaths, was $75 a month. So not adjusting for inflation. They were making what people are making in Bangladesh today. And in Bangladesh, they had the fire at the Rana Plaza where 2,000 people got killed. But it's so distant from us that we don't think about that fact that when you are walking through SF MoMA, which is funded by J. Crew, or you're walking through Walmart-funded Crystal Bridges, you are walking through a place that is currently, today, abusing labor. So when we talk about that in our wealth acknowledgement for Crystal Bridges, we said that money's been stolen 3 times. It's stolen from the workers in Bangladesh. It's stolen from the public sector. And then, do you know that a very large percentage of Walmart employees, which is the biggest private employer in the United States, are on food stamps today? So we are paying for that. So that money's been stolen from American workers, from workers in Bangladesh, and from the public sector. That's something we have to keep in our mind as this is happening. But what happened after that is what you have to think about. That sparked the labor movement. It sparked the movement to allow women to vote by 1920. It sparked all kinds of progressive movements, which later in the century blossomed into the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, which made America much more equitable by mid-century than it was. So it could happen again, right? But we're at that nadir right now. It's not a unique moment. It's a moment that's like where we were 120 years ago, and the rich people have grabbed back the power, they've lowered the taxes, they've rigged the system. But if you don't think the system was rigged then, also in the media, you're wrong.
Thank you so much. Just going to go to a slightly different angle, which is the future. Because I think that the difference, because there's all these similarities, the difference is what people want into the future. So Chrissy, you're saying that there are trustees who are very, very generous now. What is certainly true is that the future generation of trustees with that kind of generosity is not there in the same way. Because of the fact that you've got a kind of double problem. You have museums that have expanded, because most museums are run on capital campaigns, not on strategic plans. So museums have expanded and expanded and expanded, and so they cost more money to keep going, and so you're asking for an awful lot more, which means that it's not going to other parts of society. But also, younger generations, in my experience, aren't so interested in the kudos of the museum as the place that they want to get their reflection back. The generation that are at the kind of top now really support museums because they believe in what the museum is, and they will, they enjoy that kind of recognition. And there are so many younger people, the kids of those people, who are less interested. And so I think we're at this kind of moment where understanding these large-scale museums and what they stand for, they don't have the same intimacy, they don't have the same. So I think that that's maybe the difference.
You're even more pessimistic than I am.
I have to sort of push back a little bit because we have young patrons and trustees who are surprisingly committed to also social justice. One of our new young trustees is very committed to women's women's health and women's social justice in particular. So I think I'm actually I really think that maybe because the Whitney is the Whitney and it's more sort of artist driven, we are attracting younger patrons
with
and trustees with money, with quite serious money who have a social justice interest. To my surprise and pleasure, because then you get to work with people who really understand what we're trying to do. you know, I think also what you're describing, Tom, which is which I completely agree with, is now a global phenomenon. You know, Berlin is also ruined. You know, and I find myself looking to Italy because real estate can't happen in places like Rome or Venice. It just can't. And so they're weirdly some of the most contemporary modern cities around, precisely because you can't do anything to them. And so they can really actually act as quite, and so I think those are really interesting models to look at. London's ruined, Berlin's ruined, you know, Hong Kong, the whole thing. It's this global hyper capitalism that you're describing is eroding the ability of artists and the general population to live in a city affordably, to have the sort of quality of life and healthcare and education that everyone should have. And so the question of museums is so tied up with that you know, this becomes a very sort of global, which is back to the archipelagic thinking that, you know, this is a global problem, and so it behooves all of us to actually also, I think, work with our colleagues in other countries and in other systems to learn from each other and think about different ways of kind of exchanging ideas and working in the environment didn't come up, but that's, you know, that's going to be even more dramatic in the 5 year. You know, we have 5 years left to get the carbon footprint down, and America and India and China are the 3 countries that are, you know, really screwing everything else up. And there was 30 years when Al Gore and his Republican rival were both, before environmentalism was climate change was politicized, they both wanted the change, and it was the, as we know, fossil fuels guys who put the kibosh on it so that we now have 5 years. And so I think that museums across the world, and certainly here in 5 years' time, that's when things are going to get very scary. 60 people just died yesterday in Valencia because of massive floods that are unprecedented. So, you know, we have a barrier around the Whitney 17 foot high to mitigate against the next Hurricane Sandy, but then some say it's going to be 30 feet. So, you know, should we think about that as well?
Oh yeah.
I just want to throw one more thing out there to your question. It's like, I mean,
you were talking about the funding that's just coming in from the Whitney, but the large press at the moment is that Julie Moretti is somebody who is given a lot of money towards making sure that 25-year-olds and under. And, you know, this isn't new either. You know, in the Gilded Age, artists were rich, but it's the first time in a very long time that artists are starting to, if you look at what's happening across Africa with the residency spaces and the art spaces that are happening there, they're all being funded by artists who are making their money in the West. And then, so you could say that there's more independence on the part of artists to either choose to fund a very established institution or to set up their own. And we're seeing that more and more in places outside of the kind of Western structures.
And that, by the way, one of the things in the book that so Pablo Helguera obviously knows Mexico well. There's been a long tradition of artist-funded museums, either under their own name or not. Like Francisco Toledo created a museum not under his own name. So the other thing, just to mention, the biggest part of the carbon footprint of the museum world is not the building, it's not travel, it's tourism. So 8% of the carbon footprint of our species is tourism. And so I did an analysis for this book, or I didn't. I got a guy to do it who knows how to do this, who's a climate scientist. And he said that the carbon footprint of the Metropolitan Museum building plus local travel is 1/10 of the carbon footprint of long distance travel. And that's taking into consideration that people come here for a variety of reasons. But so then that's the sort of thing of, that we're thinking of also, how do you think of museums being more local? Can museums not try to always look for international elites, but to look down the street? So when Michelle Obama, I was at the opening of the new Whitney, which I love. I keep saying that, right? I love the building. I could stop saying that. Okay. And Michelle Obama said, are people from the public housing down the street going to be able to come up the street? There's a bigger barrier she was sort of saying, than coming from Tokyo or Berlin, that the barrier of walking down the street from public housing in New York City. So that's our question. One of the questions of the book is how to open the door of museums to really take seriously and become much more different from one another by looking very locally, and that will have a huge effect on their carbon footprint. I was very happy to see that the Met's new statistics, did you see that? Is that New Yorkers are going to the Met at more than pre-COVID numbers, and international tourism is down. And that's a little bit true also for general tourism to New York City. I think that's good, and maybe one of the reasons is it costs tourists $25 to get in. I think that's it. Okay.
It really hurts to end such a rich discussion. Thank you so much for all the time, all the efforts you put into these presentations and talks. Actually, I even wanted to have time to respond to each other's presentations, so there was a lot of agreement, but a lot of disagreement on this table, and I'm sure we would go for at least another hour talking. But speaking of workers' rights, I have to let people go home. I would like to thank again to all the presenters here and everyone who stayed until the end. I'd like to thank our student Kyle Colon here, who took a great care of sound. And eventually made a great reminder that we should end it. And my colleague Ricky here, who's been taking great care of all the slides and preparations of this. We have our colleague Ree McBride behind us, also helping us, and our department chair, Stephen Henry Meadow, who couldn't be with us today, who accommodated my insistence of meeting in person finally, not in Zoom. And these wonderful people, Omar and Halil here, who's been taking care of the video recordings of this event so we can share it with general public. Thank you very much to everyone for being here, all the students who helped also setting up the space. So I hope to continue this wonderful discussion. Thank you a lot.